Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for hanging around. Looking forward to this next chat. We have Suresh Sidhu and Diptendu Mitra to discuss how 5G is progressing. Before we do, just like to thank our sponsors again who make all of this, possible. So I'd welcome two gentlemen to the stage. Hope you enjoy it, and please feel free to ask questions, raise your hand if you have something. Thank you.
Good morning. We're running a bit low on attendance, but I guess we proceed anyway. Okay, thank you for making time. Quick introduction. My name is Diptendu Mitra. I'm a principal in Analysis Mason here in Singapore. I'll be moderating this fireside chat, and I'm very happy to have somebody who's very well known to people in the telecom industry in the APAC region, Mr. Suresh Sidhu. Suresh, maybe if you can introduce yourself a little bit before we go into the topics.
Sure, Diptendu. Hello, everyone. I'm Suresh. Currently I sort of run a regional tower platform, but have previously spent quite a number of years already in the telecom space. And I think I've pretty much done everything from wholesale to MNOs to, fiber, so happy to be here and, happy to chat and provide some perspectives.
Super. Thank you. So I have a few questions that we want to talk about, but at the end of it, or even during the presentation, if you have any questions from the audience, do feel to raise your hand, and we'll make time for those. So the topic today, Suresh, is about 5G, as the organizers mentioned. I think 5G is being rolled out pretty much in so many different countries. APAC, in Singapore, China's had it for a while. But I think what the elephant in the room is, what exactly is 5G going to enable that is not possible with earlier technologies? And the jury, in my mind, the jury is still a little bit out in terms of what is exactly 5G going to provide that other previous generations of tech have not. Would be keen to hear what you think and where the opportunities are for carriers, for example.
Sure. No, I think that is a good question. Let's start with the difficult stuff first. So I think, I think there's maybe two ways to look at it. The one is, it's probably fairly clear what 5G can enable. Maybe the question is, will it enable it in a way that, you will experience it, right? So I don't know if you know the great conspiracy theory that only even Gs work out for the industry, right? Everybody had a 1G, 2G was great, 3G sucked, 4G was great, 5G will suck, right? Let's wait for 6G. So I think it's very funny. If I look back, I joined the telecom industry. My first job was strategy head at Maxis many, many years ago. And it was around the time of the 3G launch. And the things we were telling people we were going to do with 3G are exactly the same that we're telling people we're going to be doing with 5G, except I guess technology has caught up. So I believe that the ability to do these things, whether it's private networks, provide massive real-time gaming, reduce latency. So all the characteristics of 5G seem to work. Then you butt up against reality, right? So reality is a more interesting thing. How will people actually make money from it? And I think that's probably the more constraining factor that we will have to face. And different markets are different. Will it be more consumer-centric, more enterprise-centric? If it's consumer, will people pay more or not? Right? I think so. Those are the questions. But I guess things that have promise in some. In APAC, I'm not sure there's a head of steam yet for it, but perhaps what I see are consistent themes in people thinking about what they want to monetize from 5G. Clearly, entertainment and gaming, right? I think every operator has got a massive entertainment strategy now, And you'll see in the Philippines, for example, you'd argue that Globe and PLDT are more digital, kind of asset managers now. Sorry, not asset, but digital kind of, managers now than anything else. Private networks, I think, also seem to attract a lot of interest. Fixed wireless access, for which quite a number, the Philippines, for example, has really taken 5G as a fixed wireless option for now. I guess, some of the more sophisticated kind of applications outside of pure, access, that's more difficult to call, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's to be seen whether you really can work in an ecosystem for autonomous driving and all the other stuff that people talk about, right? But I think providing sensibly fast access with low latency for things that are relatively simple to do, but you do better, or you can do for yourself in a private network, might be the more likely use cases that have, some potential.
No, I think, like with any new technologies, there's always a bit of, the teething issues in the beginning. Although one could say 5G's been around for a few years in some markets, but in some markets it's still sort of starting out. So we have to see, I think, how it pans out. But FWA, as you mentioned, that's interesting, especially in Asia, where you have markets where there is much less penetration of fixed broadband, for example, DSL or fiber. So in those markets, maybe you would say that there is a better chance of something like 5G succeeding in the near term.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. I guess it all depends on national spectrum strategy and how you want to use your spectrum. I think they'll deploy FWA, on mid-band and lower band spectrum to give people good, quality coverage. But I can't see people building a huge FWA spectrum on higher band, for example. But I agree with you. I think there should be some potential. Around FWA, and it's probably the broader question is whether because mobile players are likely to drive it, do they drive a mobility-based, broadband experience, which is what they're good at, or do they try and convert to a more home, slightly static-based mobility, broadband experience? So, so again, the challenges are not about technology; they're all about skills, capabilities, and the return, on a dollar of investment, right?
And being able to, I guess, craft a proposition that for FWA that is reasonably competitive to fixed broadband. I mean, it's never going to be as competitive as fiber, for example, but at lower speeds in certain countries, it may still make sense.
Yeah, look, you're not going to get fiber everywhere, right? And it's going to be much easier to get fiber to the tower, work with people like us, and then kind of sort of provide an onward experience using some wireless technology, right? So you've got a ton of places to cover. And we're in Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And I think even in Malaysia, which is a fairly highly penetrated fiber market, once you get out to Borneo, Sabah, and Sarawak, it's just, are you really going to roll out fiber everywhere? Well, you might, but how many years will that take, right? So I suspect that FWA will play a big part in regulator plans, and probably there'll be a bit of a push in the coming couple of years. Spectrum's been allocated and not much has been done. So there'll be a bunch of questions that everyone has to answer when they next sit down with their respective regulatory bodies as well.
Yeah. I think moving on from the service side, 5G is also, or rather telecom industry also has seen some new deployment models. I mean, you've got, sharing of networks has been around for a while, but you've got now cases where you have countries having single wholesale networks. Some countries have done it before 5G, some countries doing it for 5G henceforth. Do you see this as something that's likely to stay in this industry? Is it the reality going forward, basically, that you don't have individual networks anymore, you have kind of consolidation of networks at some level?
Yeah, so one thing I always try and stay away from is absolutist views and answers because you know, you usually get burnt in the end. But I think that very important, one absolute truth though, is that 5G has changed the way forever, and probably its biggest impact is on the, you know, the concept of the network, which is a highly vertically integrated, largely centralized, processed sort of, you know, information manager, right? And connectivity manager. So that's changed. It's changed forever for a number of reasons, right? It's changed because the economic abilities of operators to invest in such dense networks. So we talk about the promise of 5G. It'll only happen if significant density is there, right? Otherwise, it'll just be kind of nice, a slightly better experience, you know? So in order to afford the capital, you know, operators need to rethink how to do the network. So, you know, the first wave has probably been seen already in here in ASEAN, which has largely had relatively tightly vertically integrated MNOs. But they've sold their towers, they've sold their data centers, they'll sell their fiber in the next couple of years. And they want to move off asset and development, right, and outsource it. So that's the first wave, the fact that infrastructure as a business is firmly established and that nobody looks to be an owner of third-party, of their own infrastructure, but rather use third-party assets, right? So, and that's a given. The second thing is, you know, topology of the 5G network, you know, means you'll do it differently. You move it closer to the edge, right? And I think all designers move it closer to the edge. So the types of players and the types of things people want to move closer to the edge are the types of things that sat in very large data centers or huge switch rooms, you know, and both, I think, the previous panel essentially, you know, and, you know, the sort of, you know, the change in technology capabilities means you can distribute this network much more. And these type of conversations are not pipe dreams, by the way, because, you know, we do a very, very simple business, right? We basically say, you want space? Go ahead, right? We don't, you know, and the less sophisticated we make it, the better, frankly. That's the secret to our success. But I'm amazed at the number of people that now approach us, and I see this as maybe not, it's not that 5G is driving this, but it's symptomatic of something shifting. So for the first time ever, I have significant discussions with IoT players I've never heard of in my life who want to put up hundreds of sensors on the sites, you know. So they're being funded. First thing you want to know is, can they pay you, actually? That's the other thing. But secretly, we're a bank, right? So, you know, can they pay you? And they can, okay. Are they willing to sign long-term contracts, which is the nature of our business? Yes, reasonably long-term. We've got a lot of people talking to us about edge router hosting and other stuff as well. So the types of people we interact with in my relatively staid, you know, unchanging part of the business is actually proliferating, right? Which is something which, you know, has come to my attention because of the kinds of people who ping me the whole time now, right? So the third thing is the amount of money, back to the point I made at the beginning, that needed is so huge that I think for the first time ever, operators actually want to sit down and have no choice but to think about how to create and invest in network, and they may have to do that jointly, right? Yeah. The fourth force, so I think you see a lot of operator harmonized efforts, whether it's Korea, rural, 5G cooperation. I think Germany's got some sort of shared networks, you know, as well. Yeah. Well, here in Singapore. To the ultimate force, which is what you talked about, 5G as a public good. For the first time ever, you know, governments would spend their time talking to us about better coverage, but they never talk to us about the G that you particularly need to use, right? So for the first time, you cannot go anywhere without meeting a minister or a regulator and, you know, even, as I said, in our state part of the business, talking about 5G, right? You know? So the pressure from governments to drive good coverage is the other interesting force that people will have to manage or navigate. And the extreme example is Malaysia, right? So Malaysia's got the single 5G network, which, you know, was not the easiest thing to do, I have to say. And, you know, proved to be not just complex to create, but I think also difficult to navigate politically, not just with politicians, but also with the industry, right? So we've got to a point which, you know, in true Malaysian style, just when it looked like we sorted out, we have an election, so therefore let's wait and see what happens next. But I don't think Malaysia will be the sole example, right? And the only country to ever do this. So the idea that governments will create or mandate or push, you know, much more shared infrastructure resembling, you know, the electricity industry, for example, right? No one ever complains about a single transmission network, interestingly, right? So, you know, so let's see, right? So when all of those pieces, how those pieces work in every country will be different, right? But broadly, yes, 5G will lead to much more sharing. There will be much deeper sharing, and there will be more common use of shared networks by, you know, everyone, right?
I think the Malaysia model is definitely interesting. I mean, it's not completely unique. I mean, similar models have been tried in other markets before, but we have to see how this works out. As you said, there are many different things that have to fall in place for this to be successful. And maybe if it is successful and it works out well, then this model serves as the blueprint for similar, not identical, but maybe similar things in other countries. But what does that mean, though? Sorry, what does that mean in terms of infrastructure requirements, though? Because you have now a single, let's say, national network. Yes, with 5G, maybe you have edge data centers and maybe more towers. So in terms of net infrastructure requirements, would you think this is going to go up, or do you see some reduction in that going forward?
So I think the way to think about it is that, you know, there will be significant growth, but perhaps less growth than a 3-network type arrangement, right? Because there should in theory be the ability to optimize sites, you know, build ones, you know, and so forth. So I think the way we look at it, in where sharing markets proliferate, there will still be significant growth. The driver of significant growth is the fact that you're using 3500, you know, and above spectrum, and you just need more sites. It doesn't, like, that's it, right? So, so physics dictates that there will have to be more locations. Whether that's, by the way, whether it's sites, you know, with more sites comes more routers, you know, more data use means more data center capacity. So all that will grow. The cap on that growth is the fact that, you know, being a single network, there will be efficiencies if designed well, right? Single networks don't always have to be designed well, so, you know, but the way we look at it is, you know, if you're thinking about markets with, say, 20 or 30% growth in terms of installed infrastructure, that will taper down over time and be, you know, sort of less, it would be a sort of smaller number over a long run because of the sharing, right?
But what about the private network story? I mean, we hear a lot about private network opportunity for, you know, millimeter wave spectrum and 5G. And again, in countries, spectrum has been available. Would you think, in this region, in APAC, for example, would you see that as driving infrastructure needs in the near term?
Look, I think, you know, private networks are, your spectrum is available. I think, you know, there are some sort of mechanisms by which, you know, people can approach, you know, and create private networks. I think the use cases will be relatively limited for the time being to things that really need a private network. So, you know, complexity of building this, I think even operators struggle with what does it mean to build and run a private network. You know, they're not really, that's not in the DNA, so there's always a mindset and skill understanding. But if you're looking at where private networks will happen, I think, you know, you also look at large geographic installations that have some need for things moving around a lot, right? So, you know, so what is that? A port, right? Or airports. So I think logistics will be a principal sort of adopter of private networks. and a driver of these as well. So if you look around anyway in APAC, where are the private networks today, whether they were 4G or even these ones, even in, I think the Philippines are trying to do some 5G private networks for the ports at the moment. Yeah. So that's the most likely first step. The second one is national security services. Which currently run on, sort of like Tetra, So, and then everyone has their phone anyway, right? So the guy, I never understood the security and how that worked if everybody used WhatsApp while, supposedly being on Tetra. So I think, that's an interesting application because that should give them an end-to-end approach to data, comms and so forth. And like a lot of industrial parks approach us to discuss it with them. Can you organize and orchestrate the infra for a private network? But, the use case is not super clear unless somebody has a massive need to track assets or robotics, right? And not stationary robotics, right? Because a lot of things can be done with Wi-Fi to the level that people need, support today, right? So I haven't quite seen those. There's a lot of interest, but I'm a bit skeptical with that being the leading edge, as an adopter of the private network technology. Right?
No, I think definitely also early days for that. But also with 5G, you have a scenario with private networks where the networks necessarily not operated by the MNOs. The license is actually given to maybe a semiconductor company or an airport or something like that. So that could also fundamentally change how the entire landscape adapts.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, it'll be interesting, right? And licensing schemes in countries change. So in Malaysia, we can run a private network. We have all the licenses required to run a private network. We can build it, we can apply for spectrum, we can radiate, right? Because we are fully licensed. So there will be, so I think 5G will lead to different parties trying to do things, but the first adoption still has to come back to use case, right? And I think, also to anywhere where perhaps it's worth a customer, whether the customer is also the operator, wanting to create it, right? So they must have a real economic need for requiring, these private networks. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think there has to be a business case for these things to work. I mean, the technology's been there, technology's around, improving forever, but the business case has to exist. I think the other stakeholder, of course, in telecoms is the regulator, right? The regulatory support for any new telecom technology is important. For this entire 5G ecosystem to work, whether it's your towers, your edge data centers, your small cells, etc. Do you see things that regulators could do a little bit differently that could maybe help infrastructure players, that could help align or bring capital a little bit more easily into the region? Are there things that could be improved in the region, especially?
I think, if you want to if we talk about ASEAN, there are many different approaches to infrastructure and the different classes of infrastructure. So Indonesia is an interesting one. To be a tower operator, you need to do nothing, just collect money, get orders, acquire sites and build, right? To build fiber, you need a license, right? To add antenna to the tower and assist the operator in radiating it, you also need a different license, I think, right? So, so every country's got this licensing scheme or structure around service authorizations that are a little bit based on, I think, still a 2G, 3G world, right? So that has to change. I think it needs to recognize that the amount of investment required. So one is telecom regulations, making it easier for infrastructure specialists to be multi-line and perhaps also being comfortable with blurring the line between active and passive, right? I think there's a point where you manage customers and you radiate significant amounts of spectrum. And there's points where you provide local solutions like a private network or even a shared rural network, which I feel fall in the world of, an infra solution as opposed to an operator or a kind of mobile approach, right? So I think regulators need to work out how to draw that line. And I would say across ASEAN, it would be great if they somewhat harmonized around that approach. Not just because we're in 3 countries, it'll be so much easier. But I think, it will attract the right level of investment, which is the second point. It's not just telecom kind of rules that need to change, probably the FDI rules as well. This is very, very long-term capital. And all the countries approach it in slightly different ways. It's not, you can always find incentives and things elsewhere, but it's a question of how easy is it for you to sort of access capital and create these long-term investments in infrastructure, which I always try to explain to regulators that, we should worry less, particularly as this is essentially still largely passive. We're building walls, towers, fencing, it's not really that sensitive. Secondly, you can't take it away. We can't leave Indonesia and take 10,000 towers away. We have to leave them behind, right? So the infrastructure really stays as a capital good and a capital asset of the country, right? So I think a better appreciation of what you're trying to do and understanding that the world has changed. And while they typically are very pro 5G, I think both the finance and the telecom ministries haven't really understood what it means to create the enabling environment to truly get the right services and the right investment into the country.
Well, I don't know whether there's anybody from the regulator in the audience, but I do hope they're listening to you.
I'm good. I say this to everyone to their face, by the way.
I think an environment where there would be alignment of regulation across regions, across countries, EU style, would definitely be useful. But complicating this, of course, is the geopolitics the situation that we are in. So, does that impact, in your view, or is that likely to impact anything in terms of rollout of 5G, or how successful 5G is, or how effective 5G can actually be in terms of providing the services that people think it will?
Yeah, I think the geopolitics question, will play out differently for different elements of the telecom value chain or for different countries and so forth. But generally, I'd say ASEAN is a winner in the current geopolitical climate, right? It's a winner. And geopolitics isn't just Russia, Ukraine, Huawei versus the US, COVID, whatever. There are multiple factors over the last few years that made us realize that, geopolitics is wildly relevant to our businesses. We thought they weren't, but they are. So COVID has been a boon to ASEAN because everyone realizes that they need to diversify supply chains. Next best option, ASEAN, right? ASEAN countries also have a high degree of, I think, harmony and a willingness to work together, in spite of the typical tensions, right? So I actually believe that there is, that's also a benefit here. We'll see, more common approaches develop because it is the nature of ASEAN to develop common approaches without requiring massive, national integration, right? So, geopolitics probably means that you have to think much more clearly about your vendor set because you're subject to scrutiny. And geopolitics makes its way into all kinds of things, unfortunately. Or fortunately, depending on which side of the fence you sit on, from your bank debt, to your investor sort of disclosures that they need to make for compliance. So ultimately, nearly everything goes back to the US one way or the other. A certain percentage of everyone's dollar that's invested in their companies goes to the US. If it goes to the US, you have to comply with a massive number of things, which are not the typical, ABAC type stuff. That's more straightforward. But it's everything from like, is your vendor set, right? Are you You know, if you're US, if you've got any kind of government leaked funds from the US, then you definitely can't use, you know, sort of Chinese vendors, right? In core networks as well, right? You know, so I think here are some elements that are the truth, and you'll find your bank asking you to make sure that you don't do it. Yeah. So it's appearing all over. We have to adjust for it. Yeah. But I think ASEAN, on the whole, looking at geopolitics, is a net winner. I think infrastructure is a big winner out of geopolitics because, you know, it's the same question as diversifying your supply chain. You have to localize your infrastructure chain as well, right? Every country wants to make sure that national security issues are taken care of. Fundamentally, that's communications infrastructure, and they want to build more onshore, in-country, and have less reliance on massively internationally distributed networks outside of common countries that they can rely on, right?
Yeah. Well, I hope, I mean, I hope that's how it's going to pan out, because I think, as you rightly said, ASEAN potentially in a better position to navigate this situation. And there are indeed efforts to sort of, you know, make sure the industry is not as disrupted from, you know, the politics of the situation. Unfortunately, the industry is regulated, so there is always some political interference, political influence. But let's hope that we can all, you know, work around it or work with it. I'm just conscious that we have like a little bit time left, so I'm going to ask if anybody in the audience has anything to ask.
Is that what is playing out?
Yeah, you know, I think you look, I actually think it's about, I wouldn't say it's about to shift. I think life will look a little rosier for mobile service providers over the next 5 years if they get a few things right. So it's better than it has been. And one of the things is to work out who you really are, right? I think it's clarifying, right? You know, the days of deciding to become an e-commerce hub, you know, are disappearing. Everybody wanted to be a payments guy. You can't compete with Ant, right? You know, or Grab, right? So you have to realize what you cannot do, right? And so I actually believe that sort of if they continue this path of being a bit more agile, you know, pushing for scale, there'll probably be less operators. Then I think things are about to shift a little bit in the direction of the mobile operators' favor than it has been for the past few years, right? So consolidation makes things a little tougher for infra guys. We have less people to play off against, so we have to give away a bit of margin and, you know, for long-term contracts. But without a doubt, it will still be far easier to be the infra player because the model for us is simple. We don't have to pick winners. We just have open, unfettered access, and, you know, let the winners duke it out, right? So if you ask me if I want to go back to, you know, to running mobile operators, I will politely decline and stay in the nice, wonderful space that we have for us, you know, in the tower world, which I think will evolve. So as I said, my customers will change. We will be pretty fiberized, right? We have a lot of IoT customers. By next year, I think I will have, you know, like hundreds of locations with small guys paying us not a lot of money, but interesting, like never happened before. Like you used to, you know, pick up one or two things. I even have like high velocity traders wanting to put equipment up on my sites, right? So there's change. So for us, it's interesting. We'll get pressures on our margins, I think, as the operators build up their digital businesses or their reach, or their transformation into a more customer-centric world. There'll be less of them, of course, as we said. And so but we might gain in infrastructure from serving a broader set of customers. Yeah.
Thanks. Suresh, EU always sets a good example for regulatory, and I have 27 nations, much bigger than ASEAN. And you mentioned your hope of more harmonization. What are the odds of this happening? And if I can go on beyond that, what would be any best practices that you wish are there within ASEAN?
I think the odds are reasonable, actually, and that they can happen. I mean, it took even the EU's integrated approach takes like 20 years before they publish something, right? So it's not exactly the fastest. I think the odds depend a little bit on political stability across the multiple countries, right? And if the actors that are in that space stay roughly the same for the next few years, then I think you'll see, it sort of happening, right? It depends at the end of the day on, I think, the strength and relationships, as ASEAN always does, on the various prime ministers and presidents and how they get on with each other. They won't know the details, but if they are committed, something will happen. So, I think we're about to hit a slightly more stable period in politics as well. So that should prove to be beneficial for the creation of this. I have a very simple thing. I think common definitions around what is essentially infra-style businesses versus service operator type businesses, right? It's tougher than it seems, because is a dumb antenna infra or is it service side, right? And every country has a different rule, right? And so, where it would make perfect sense for infill sites that we provide fiber, pole, integrated cluster antennas, a router on it, all in one. I can only do that in Malaysia. I can't really do that everywhere else because it's like, antenna, cannot, So, and no one can tell me why, by the way, just because cannot, right? So I think we have to push for this sort of, common understanding of where the network ends as a infrastructure project and where it begins as a social good or public good for consumers and citizens, right?
Any last questions? No? Okay. Thank you, Suresh, for your candid and great conversation. I think if anybody has any questions, please feel free to reach out to us.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Diptender and Suresh. Fascinating conversation there. And yeah, I would encourage anyone who has questions to meet the gentleman after and continue the dialogue. We have a couple minutes now before the next session, which will be looking at the relationship between content and connectivity. So please hang around and look forward to that. Thank you.